Sophia, of course, is a personal friend, but in her academic and in her professional capacity, she is an experienced scholar practitioner with a proven track record of providing expert business strategy advice. She currently serves as the director of Columbia University's Program for Economic Research, and her own research focuses on analyzing governance patterns and location of economic activity after market reforms. She has broad knowledge of private and public sector reforms, public policy, regulatory compliance, and marketing data-driven decisions with demonstrated ability to manage research teams, cultivate relationships with stakeholders, to support economic planning and strategic initiatives, advise senior leadership, and thereby shaping global agenda and enabling meaningful and enduring impact. She has taught at New York University, Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, as well as Seton Hall University School of Diplomacy and International Affairs. She served as visiting scholar at the American Institute of Indian Studies, the Developing Countries Research Center at Delhi University, Population Research Center at the University of Kashmir, and the Center for Development Studies also in India. To give a brief background, Sophia not only is an academic in her own capacity, she is also author of 2 books. And so one of the books is about how women in academics can flourish. Living Beautifully is the name of the book. She also wrote a book when her, elder daughter was, just a baby, and she wanted to express what her mother needs to tell to her daughter. So she wrote a book on that. She also was a journalist before she started her PhD, and she has, I don't know how many countries you have gone to, Sophia, maybe I can't count, but all over the world. She's basically a Caribbean Canadian by descent. And she has a very multicultural family. She married Vietnamese, and so her daughters are Vietnamese Caribbean Canadian. Yeah. So over to you, Sophia. We are so looking forward to this presentation.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Dr. Goswami is a true friend and a very well-respected colleague, and we, as she said, I'm really delighted and excited to be here with you today. So the topic for today's discussion is really an examination of the extent to which we can identify a solution to the inequality problem that is historically embedded in the American experience, but also as things have come to a head and flared up with the recent killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So it is, I'm exploring, it's an exploratory project, exploring the extent to which corporate social responsibility can help to alleviate the pressures of inequality in a society that is suffering. So just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm sorry? So just a little bit of housekeeping before I begin. If you're following this on social media, if you are on social media, I would really like you to follow the hashtag Dr. Sophia Johnson, but also you can follow us on Twitter in the Department of Economics at Columbia_econ. And also these hashtags are have much to do with the subject that we're talking about today, and it would be a wonderful tool to extend the conversation. That's hashtag inequality, hashtag corporate social responsibility, and hashtag best solution. Again, a hypothetical space. So just a little bit about the Program for Economic Research at Columbia University. We're focused on consistently trying to find innovative ways to expand access to issues like inequality, to address them in a policy-making space. We pride ourselves on being really a think tank for the field of economics, and with the view towards projecting policy ideas into the deep circuit space. So when I initially was invited to this conversation, my first thought was to think on this question of the best solution for inequality and whether or not corporate social responsibility. I started to sort of think on where can we possibly look for some solution. And, you know, much of my original early scholarship is in the area of environmental sustainability. So I was immediately drawn to Rachel Carson's classic work, which basically launched the environmental movement, Silent Spring, which was published in 1962. And we're going to talk on and off about Carson's contribution, not only to the field of environmental governance, but also its legacy, its reaches in other spaces. So one of the key things that comes out of Carson's work is the idea that we can't just have firms running wildly in our society. It was really a call for humans to act responsibly, to carefully serve as stewards while they're living on Earth. So yes, she wants innovation. Yes, she wants experimentation because she herself was a biologist, but she wants some responsibility to come with that. And there was a lot of pushback, as you can imagine, from the business community. A great deal of pushback because they wanted to serve and innovate with no regulatory restrictions. So this was really pushing businesses and pushing society to think a little bit differently about how we're innovating, but the impact of that innovation on people, the harm that it can potentially cause. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of her work and its reaches. Early activists of contemporary environmental movement certainly attribute a lot of successes, legislative successes that they've had in the United States to Carson's work. To my left, there's an image of a young man in New York on the first Earth Day, which was celebrated in New York. He's wearing a gas mask. And what's really interesting about this image is that it's almost an insult because during the 1970s, America was in the middle of a Cold War, and gas mask had its legacy in World War II and also Pearl Harbor and all the disasters that were happening around nuclear energy. But what's interesting here is that this young man has decided to put this mask on, suggesting that I can't breathe, and to smell a beautiful flower like a magnolia in New York City, I'm going to have to wear a mask because these flowers are coated with DEET, which is a heavy toxin that has impact on your respiratory system. So it's interesting, but it's also a very powerful message that early activists took that and sort of used Rachel Carson's work to say, here's what we're really concerned about. Here's what the real impact is. So let's talk a little bit about some of the major successes that early activists attribute to her work. Well, first of all, the Clean Air Act of 1963 never would have come into being without Carson's contribution, right? The Clean Air Act was really designed to encourage firms to be a little bit more proactive and to adhere to certain rules and regulations in terms of pushing out waste out of their manufacturing firms. In 1970, we have, from the picture here, the first celebration of Earth Day, which began in 1970, and it's an annual celebration. So it really is a pause, but it's also a space for environmentalists to constantly return to this conversation, a constant reminder for policymakers and politicians that this is something that's really important to constituents. In 1972, we have two big things that happened in 1972. And before I get to 1972, there's 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency, Richard Nixon signed that into law. And that particular agency is responsible for monitoring the behavior of firms acting in communities across the countries, right? To make sure that helping to shape legislation that can monitor the behavior of firms. In 1972, we have the Clean Water Act, and also the beginning of what has served as the annual Earth Summit. Every 10 years or so, excuse me, there's the annual Earth Summit. And the focus of the Earth Summit is really to congregate under the umbrella of the United Nations countries that are interested in advancing environmental and synchronizing their environmental rules and regulations. So this particular conference is really important because every 10 years is a space where environmentalists and businesses can evaluate the impact of environmental pollutions on the health and safety of people in different parts of the world. This conference has been happening every 10 years, with the exception of 1982, at the height of the Cold War. It was really seen as a dangerous time to travel. But it's, you know, since then, 1992 and 2002, the meetings have been ongoing. So really, this, in many ways, I know it's a lot from 1962 to 1972, but that really captures what early activists feel Rachel Carson has done for them, what she has brought to the table, and the legacy and reaches of her work, in that she's impacted a whole body of laws and regulations to help us think domestically, but also internationally, about how we govern the state. But I think what's really, really instrumental, particularly to the conversation we're having here about inequality and corporate social responsibility, is pulling on that earlier term that she talked a little bit about, and the idea of call for humans to act responsibly. And that really becomes important when we start talking about corporate social responsibility, which has its reaches in the environmental experience. But so what we take from Carson and what we take from environmentalists during the 60s and 70s is this idea that corporations should be doing more, right? Should be doing more to address wider social issues, should be demonstrating that they have a vested interest in the communities that they serve. And so that becomes really important, because between 1962 and the present, we're seeing the power of corporate social responsibility. And this conversation is... Hello? And this conversation is really about evaluating CSR. So this summer in the United States, we have the killing of George Floyd. Immediately, corporations all over the place, including Starbucks, start tweeting and giving away Frappuccinos and saying, listen, Black Lives Matter. Well, yes, Black lives matter, no more than other lives, but certainly no less than other lives. But the corporations are starting to think about their constituents, thinking about the communities that they serve, and they start tweeting and giving away prizes and this type of a thing. Well, Mark Kramer, a colleague of mine, and I know you've read a little bit about his work already, his organization, FSG, sends out a tweet in July of this year saying, really, it's no longer enough to say your organization is not racist. Corporations must actively be anti-racist. So it really begs the question on whether or not this is an effective strategy, right? So for Starbucks giving away Frappuccinos, is that the solution to pacify people who've been suffering with issues related to inequality? And the answer obviously is no. But the response that Mark Kramer's organization offers is really suggesting that more can be done. That's a good social gesture, but more needs to be done. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So CSR attracts customers who share the same values. People who share the values of Starbucks, the idea that we are about the community, we're not for big profits, we want to give back, we want to operate sustainably. They are trying to attract and consistently woo customers. That's really the focus. And now, there are different types of CSR initiatives out there. There's philanthropy, which we're not going to spend too much time on, but and there's also volunteerism and in the environmental conservation, which is the space that Carson's work comes out of. What we're going to talk a little bit about is the relationship between CSR and diversity and labor practices. And like I said, in the United States, with the Black Lives Matter movement, you're seeing a lot of conversation about the role of CSR in advancing diversity and labor practices. And there are ads all over the place that I tried to squeeze in as many as I could. There is the Instagram revised look. There is Nike trying to push Kaepernick, who's a very famous football player here in the United States. There is L'Oreal, there's Coca-Cola, there's McDonald's, there's Visa saying change starts here. And of course, there's the Unilever, which out of Asia is trying to sort of rethink how they brand and speak to skin lightening products, which is really, really interesting. But the whole idea is that lightness is not the best, you know what I mean? So they're trying to rethink how they brand that. They're trying to send a signal to consumers that we share your value. We're not about one shade of women. We are about, it's not, you know, I think the lotion here, I saw it when I was in Delhi last time, but it's a fair and lovely. The idea that you gotta, if you're lovely, you gotta be fair. So fairer skin. So Unilever is trying to send a signal in their recent ad campaigns to consumers that we share the same value. We love and appreciate all shades and hues of Asian women. So, a lot and a mouthful. Corporate social responsibility has its reaches in Carson's work. Corporate social responsibility is the legacy of Carson's contribution to the business and economic space. My hypothesis then is to explore if the best solution to inequality is corporate social responsibility, what is the appropriate role of business? And that really depends. And this conversation we're going to have today is really going to explore 4 questions about profit. Do they have to share their profit? Is it fair to share your profit? Social interest, is it the responsibility of corporations or the state? We're going to explore both of these perspectives. What about the behavior of these corporations? Are they acting in a democratic way? How do they determine how much money to invest in an initiative? And then we're going to talk about the firms themselves, whether or not they are the best space to implement policies to address inequality. So the first question is, may firms sacrifice profits in the social interest? May firms sacrifice profits in the social interest? Well, let's talk a little bit about the purpose of the corporation. According to Milton Friedman, and I like his work and I reference his work an awful lot, in a free enterprise, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He or she, I should have written, has direct responsibility to his employers. And that's it. The buck really stops there. That responsibility is to conduct business in accordance with the desire to make a profit. That is the first purpose of the business. The legality of corporate social responsibility in the United States is a little bit more tricky. Corporate responsibilities to shareholders and corporate responsibility is to the stakeholders. The business judgment rule is something that firms, companies are also thinking about. It's their right to make a judgment about the direction of the business. So let's look at those 2 points. Let's talk about the responsibilities of firms in the United States to CSR. There are lots of requirements and there are lots of responsibilities, but these requirements are limited in practice. It is not legally binding. They don't have to do this. They don't get in trouble. They're not going to be fined if they don't engage in it. It really is a voluntary strategy of engagement. So corporations certainly have the power, but not necessarily the right to engage in CSR activities in the United States. All these corporations here that have been tweeting that Black Lives Matter, it's a voluntary tweet, right? But obviously a tweet is not a sufficient action to quell the concerns related to inequality in the United States. The business judgment rule makes fiduciary duties difficult to enforce, and it effectively grants managers the discretion to temper their business decision according to their own values. So what do a lot of companies value in the United States in terms of they want the perception that they're doing good. They want the perception to maintain the perception that they're diverse and they care about equality. If we look at this image here, captured from a forum about a year and a half ago, a little bit over, almost a year ago at Harvard Law School, it captures what corporations are like, how they like to sort of present themselves to the business world. The idea that there's a great deal of diversity. They want to see a lot of people at the table. They want their boardrooms to be representative of the demographic. So in this particular situation, we're looking between 2016 and 2018 and recognizing that gender, race, and ethnicity are really potent issues for these corporations. And they're managing this at their own discretion. They're ensuring that African-American women and men are represented in the boardroom. They're also making sure that Asian and Pacific Islanders are present at the table, and to a lesser extent, Hispanics and Latino men and women are also being seated at the table. That is representation. It gives the illusion that we have the social values of the communities that we serve. Let's talk a little bit about the legality of CSR in other countries. It looks very different in different spaces. In the industrialized countries, and these are terms that I'm not wedded to, but industrialized countries, it's taken a little bit more seriously because they have the budget and resources for it. In some of the developing countries, multinational enterprises are investing their funds perhaps more in issues related to advertising and marketing rather than CSR. So the second question that we'll explore then is, can firms sacrifice profits in the social interest? How many firms would be interested in sacrificing their profits for advancing Black Lives Matter movement, for example, or for advancing and making sure there's a wider equality in the society that they live? Studies suggest that 6 conditions would actually facilitate the production of goods and services. The first item is regulatory constraints. Are there regulatory constraints that would force a company to sacrifice its profits for social interests? Is it very costly to sacrifice my profits for social interests? Will it reduce a firm's business expenses, and to what extent? What about compliance? Who's going to make sure I'm doing this thing? If I engage in this socially beneficial activity, will it yield an increase in revenue? So for example, Starbucks is giving away Frappuccinos and saying, yes, Black Lives Matter. Is that just a social gesture, or will it yield an increase? Will people over time say, you know what, I'm going to go to Starbucks rather than that other coffee guy because they're interested in, we have the same social value, and they were giving away free Frappuccino. I like that gesture. Or is that enough, or is it not? What about compliance, and also the idea of over compliance, which we'll talk a little bit more in a moment. So when is it feasible for firms to engage in profit sacrificing CSR, right? This is a very curious and compelling question to me. Is it feasible when they're voluntarily doing it? Is it feasible when they're reluctantly sort of saying, I guess I'm gonna have to tweet Black Lives Matter now because everyone else is doing it? Is it feasible when it's unsustainable? In 2005, GE, General Electric, earmarked $6 billion for corporate social responsibility activities in the area of healthcare. The money dried up. It wasn't sustainable. Did that make sense? Did it improve the quality of people's lives that they were trying to reach over time? So they were sacrificing $6 billion in profit, but what was the end goal if it's not sustained over time? And they made a big to-do about it in 2005, about this investment. But that's something to sort of think about. When is it really feasible to do this? Another question about feasibility and sacrificing profits for social interests is to look closely at the economic, structural, and organizational constraints on the firm. In the United States, CEOs make a lot of money, right? Of big firms especially. I'm talking about the mom and pop projects, but you and I might walk into a company and negotiate, might get a bonus pay, a base pay, and maybe some deferred compensation for retirement. These CEOs, mostly white middle-class, middle-aged men, are making beaucoup dollars. So you've got to think about the structure, the organizational constraints in the structure. To get the best CEO, you have to pay them, and you have to have a comprehensive package. And this makes it really difficult to sacrifice profits for CSR when you have this obligation to these fat cats who are supposed to help you yield greater revenue. So you look at pharmaceutical company CEOs in 2018, you got Johnson & Johnson going 46, Merck with 48 million, Nectar with 32, Pfizer 47, Regeneron 118 million. So this is basically what we're dealing with. So after you pay these CEOs this kind of money, the question is, how much resources do they have to do other things? They still have to do advertising. They still need personnel. So are they going to then invest another $32 million, for example, into CSR? How sustainable is that type of financial commitment over time? The third question then is, do firms sacrifice profits in the social interest, right? And for that, we need to think about, do they comply or do they over comply? And we're going to talk a little bit about this in a few minutes, because I have a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago. I emailed her yesterday and she fired back an email saying that she thought it was basically all rubbish, this idea of firms committing to CSR. So do firms overcomply? A first step in evaluating whether firms participate in CSR is really to determine whether they overcomply with regulations or participate in other costly activities that benefit society. Do they voluntarily engage in government programs that's going to offer them tax relief? Do they do they have voluntary industry initiatives, for example, in terms of looking at their carbon footprint or whatnot? What about shareholder resolutions? What about corporate charitable contributions? Are these companies looking for other ways to engage with society in meaningful ways? I bring up this example of the plastic bag dilemma in New York State. This plastic bag law went into effect March 1. And here we have an image of a caricature, really, of Andrew Cuomo, who is basically saying there is going to be a ban on all plastic bags. It's not allowed. You can't do it anymore. Well, enforcement has been delayed. And because of litigation by the firms who are saying that if we're going to have to engage in this social good, it's going to cost the state. So you see, it really is a little bit tricky. You've got these voluntary government programs where we're saying to these firms, we want you to participate in this thing because plastic bags aren't good for the environment. But you have the firms turning around saying, yes, we'd like to do it, but we can't do it just now because the transition to paper bag is going to be too complicated. So that's sort of where things are with the firms. They want to do it. They want to sort of send a signal that they believe in the social good, but they're also reluctant to sacrifice profits, as we're seeing here with the major plastic bag manufacturer in New York State. Is there evidence of profit sharing behavior? I thought this was curious because I thought to myself, for sure, I would find that there is a lot of evidence of firms taking responsibility for their behavior. Now, the evidence on sacrificing profits in social interests is lacking. There is some evidence of it. GE had to do a major cleanup of a river in New York. And here I have an image of a BP oil spill in 2010. And in the Gulf of Mexico, and they engaged in a little bit of cleanup, and then they left the rest of it to the state. The bulk of the available evidence suggests that most firms view socially responsible actions in a way that they view more traditional business activities, as I mentioned earlier, such as advertising and R&D. So you're going to pay your CEO $100 million, you're going to invest another $50 million in R&D, and then you're going to invest $10 million in advertising, and then you've got to pay for your personnel. Cleaning up oil spills, not high on your list, and you certainly don't want to eat into your R&D funds to clean up an oil spill, which is going to cost much more than having a couple of kids out on the water scooping up some of the garbage. So should firms sacrifice profits in the social interest? We see that there's little evidence that they are doing it, but should they do it? And the answer obviously is yes, but let's talk a little bit about it. The question of interest here is whether firms' actual CSR choices are optimal, or are there other available alternatives? I'll talk a little bit about 3 Mile Island in central Pennsylvania. I lived out in Pennsylvania for a little bit, and this particular nuclear reactor was shut down in September 2019. The power plant, before it shut down, had a lot of disasters, a lot of accidents, a lot of spills, a lot of suffering, a lot of health issues in the community. The power plant had a lot of options. They could have reduced emissions of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide. They could have switched to renewable source of fuel, and they could have implemented job training for safety, but they did none of those things. Even though they had vowed to be socially responsible in the communities that they were serving. And they didn't do that because they were concerned about profit, and they were not obviously interested in sacrificing profits in the name of social interest. In the United States, there's a lot of conversation now about the financial and health impacts of COVID-19, and its impacts, especially on race and ethnicity. There are lots of health disparities in the United States. As of today, there are about 6 million cases of coronavirus in the United States, at least 182, probably 185 by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, who have died of the virus, according to Johns Hopkins University tally. This is a disgrace on a lot of levels, but the bigger shame is that there are firms out there and there are government institutions that are not taking responsibility for their action in terms of the impact. So what you see happening with COVID-19, the data that's coming out, this sort of dreadful data, it really is a residual, it's the legacy of lack of attention to health and financial inequalities in the United States, right? And there's something that firms can do about that. Firms can pay their workers higher wage. Firms can offer health insurance, right? Firms can, so it's better wages and it's health insurance. So people would be able to address their health. If you have no state health insurance and you have no health insurance from firms that you're working for, then obviously laborers are not going to pay much attention to their health because they're not going to use their weekly paycheck to go get a checkup or a vaccine and this type of a thing. So this is a situation we find ourselves in. And it's a disgrace because it's really telling that the firms, the state didn't take on the challenge, but also the firms were not being very loyal and good to the constituents that they were serving. They were certainly underpaying people, and they weren't taking care of people in terms of their health. And now we see that all spilling over in the most grotesque way and unjust way. Now, there is also a special case in developing country economies. In Latin American countries and some Asian countries and some African countries, strong investor protections may be particularly desirable when we think about firms. And this is because legal and contractual systems often operate very weakly. It's very weak to reinforce. And I share an image here on my right of protesters demonstrating against India's new citizenship law in January 2020. Again, you have a situation where, where people are feeling that they're being slighted. Right, and it's not just an India story. It's indicative, really, of what's happening in different spaces. A lot of I could have found a similar story in Brazil or South Africa or anywhere in the Caribbean, Latin America, for that matter. So I wish I could see all your faces, because I really want to get a sense of where do we go from here. What are your thoughts? You can sort of jump in a conversation. I think I want to just take a pause to sort of get some feedback on what has taken place over the past 50 years, 50, 60 years, before we sort of leap into the role of CSR in addressing inequalities, contemporary inequalities that we've seen playing out today. Dr. Goswami? I can't hear you.
So do we open it for questions? Do you want to take some questions now? Yeah.
Before we move forward, I still have some slides, but I can take some questions.
Yeah. So I think we have both students and colleagues from different places. So if you have any question, then you can start your video, ask the question, or if you want to put it in the chat box, both are okay.
Yep.
So if there is any question, then you can put it in the chat box. I can put it across to Sophia.
Okay, so I'll keep talking.
Yeah.
Oh, so someone raised their hand.
Okay. Yeah. Then please go ahead.
Good morning, ma'am. My name is Arihant.
Good morning.
Yeah. So I just had this thought of like you were talking about the marketing. I'm not sure if that's the right word to use, but marketing that company used to do social responsibility as something that they use for marketing as well, right? Like for example, you were talking about the different companies that did help in the Black Lives Matter campaign, but do you think that the like as you were talking about spending less money on the actual work than on marketing is something that should be given a thought about as well? So what do you think about that? Is it just become like a motive for marketing, or is it more than that?
I mean, I think that's a very powerful question. I mean, I think that was what Mark Kramer, Mark Kramer pointedly said in his tweet that, when a firm is going to, here is the ad from Starbucks. You have people protesting all over the United States about social inequality. Starbucks' solution to this wide social issue is to give away free Frappuccino if you walk into Starbucks and shout Black Lives Matter. That's ridiculous. That's not a solution, but that was an ad campaign that they had to pay a big New York City firm a lot of money to come up with. So that's where Kramer says it's no longer enough. Frappuccinos aren't going to soothe the tensions brewing in this nation and the legacy of racism and injustice in this country. He's making the argument that corporations must now actively be anti-racist and not try to pacify it with this type of marketing, which a lot of them are. This is basically marketing. They might call it corporate social responsibility to give away frappuccinos, but clearly the argument here is that more needs to be done, and we're exploring that. What are your thoughts on, what is your reaction to this campaign? Did you guys see anything like that in India?
There were, I guess, yeah, a lot of them were there, which was similar to this. But don't you think the companies, like if Starbucks is doing today, tomorrow there might be another coffee company that could do it. So wouldn't be like the case of Me Too also doing this thing. So where would the bubble burst?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, during the Me Too movement, I mean, the Me Too movement hasn't ended. It's just that another movement sort of superseded it because of the political situation and the health situation. But, you know, I think that in many ways, you know, this is a situation where advertising conflates with the idea that we're being socially responsible. We have the same value. They're sending us signals to their consumers that we care, we're trying to do the right thing. But many people saw this a little bit as an insult, right? Rather than a solution. It really was an advertising campaign that they're trying to signal, you know, but then there are other people that thought it was great. While they were out protesting, they could run into a frappuccino, go into a Starbucks and get a free frappuccino, then run back on the streets and continue whatever they were doing. Some people thought it was a wonderful thing, right? I'm just wondering how something like that would be received in India. Would it be perceived as marketing, or would it be perceived as social responsibility?
Anybody wants to take that up? So interestingly, actually, we had these riots. You know, you showed the CAA protests, Sophia. Mm-hmm. So, and immediately after that, we had the Delhi riots. And you know what happened in US? You know the whole thing around George Floyd. You know, there are exactly similar kind of images which came up in India as well during the riots. But that kind of protest did not happen. But when you look at the migrant issue, like after the lockdown happened and migrants were walking like thousands of kilometers, some dying on the way. There were women who gave birth on the way and continued walking. You know, things like that happened. So, which is like unbelievable that it can happen in a civilized country. But you know, while there are government funds to do whatever. Now, how much that has worked, it's difficult to say. But a lot of common people, pulled their resources together and started doing something around in the communities around them. So that definitely happened. Now, how much business has done? Maybe that's a project for us to do and see whether business really took up the challenge and what are the things they did. But I have, in the little that we have seen around us, a lot of kind of charity driven activities started taking up. Now, how much business has done that? A lot of business actually contributed to the Prime Minister Cares Fund, which again is a non-audited entity. It's not subject to audit. So therefore, there are challenges around that. Yeah.
We have a question. Can CSR activities reduce advertising costs for a company? Very, very clever question, but also very tricky, especially in the case of Starbucks. The reality is that CSR activities, many companies are not willing to sacrifice advertising dollars for real market consumption for CSR activities, which is sort of a little bit unknown. But there are a lot of companies that are trying to, you know, like this particular ad, it does both. It's advertising and also it's CSR. So I don't know what budget it would fall into for Starbucks, but it is an important signal that can certainly be interpreted as a social good, giving a nod to the protesters, but also paying attention to their bottom line, right? So it should be treated separately and independently, but there are times when it certainly does conflate. And more companies are looking at it as a smaller piece of their budgetary expenditure as compared to advertising, right? And as compared to other types of investment like high-level CEOs and whatnot. So if there aren't, so I see another question here. Many times doing the socially right thing might be viewed and indicative of a company's political stance. So should companies be selective in the social activities they delve in, or move away or tear their companies, or I'm sorry, or there are ways companies can contribute in social reform without paying a price for their political image? That's true. So should companies be selective in social activities that they delve into? Absolutely. They certainly have to be strategic. And Starbucks was very strategic about that particular advertising campaign. But not just Starbucks, a lot of these other firms have been really very careful about what it is that they're engaging in. I'm just sort of looking for that slide that captures it all. So here we have, for example, L'Oreal being very strategic, speaking out is worth it. Coca-Cola saying together we must. Now they're not saying Black Lives Matter, but they are saying something about the issue, and they're using the color black, right? Amazon came right out and said Black Lives Matter, which people thought was good on good and bad. He had a lot, Bezos had a lot of positive and negative, and a few negative reactions, to which he said, his 20-year-old son can be arrested by a cop, but he wouldn't fear his white son's dying at the hands of a police officer, meaning there's justification for raising attention to this issue. Visa's ad was really quite simple. Change starts here. So again, they're not outright saying Black Lives Matter because they don't want they don't want their customers on the other side of the spectrum to feel slighted or left out. McDonald's came right out and said George Floyd, and Netflix again said Black Lives Matter. Twitter said Black Lives Matter. And Nike came outright and said we believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything, and that was in support of Kaepernick's walkout. And also, obviously, Instagram certainly has supported, come out right to support the movement, if that answers your question. Let's see. How would you contextualize the recent emphasis of global business community on the concept of circular economy as the way forward? I wonder if you could expand on that question, Ankit. I'll move on to the next question until you can sort of give me some more information. Unless Professor Goswami, you can offer me some insights into that question. And
Ankit, do you want to say like exactly what you mean by that? If you want, you can come on camera or just speak out also if you want. Like when you were saying circular economy, how do you contextualize, and this question we couldn't really understand what you mean by that.
The next question.
Good morning. I was trying to contextualize this discussion about the corporate social responsibility to address the issues of inequality and emphasizing upon a socially embedded responsible behavior on the part of the firms. In that context, I was just trying to put forth that there is this concept of circular economy by Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is emphasizing that we need to come up with more business models which reflects that there is vested interest of the business in promoting social good.
Professor Goswami?
Yeah, I think, this idea of business models, today's conversation is not around that, but we will actually cover that next week. Karen Henneken of University of San Diego, she will exactly cover this, and she's going to talk about different kinds of business models. So let's not take it up here. And Ankit, we are going to again have a conversation around this.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next question is, can certain marketing campaigns serve to delegitimize the movement? Absolutely. In the way that people think that they participated in the promotion of the company, therefore that have done their due diligence in participating in the cause. I think certain companies, certain marketing campaigns can serve to delegitimize the movement. Absolutely, I believe that. And that would be the firm's signal to policymakers or politicians, don't move forward with that policy, right? That's their way of sort of backhandedly lobbying for something that is going to be a disservice to their bottom line. The next question. According to many online news channels, it is indicated that the campaign by Starbucks wasn't real and Starbucks never ran such a campaign. Do companies create fake advertisements in the name of CSR to drive sales? Maybe. How do you make companies like Starbucks that have huge customer base and ability to influence the mass really care about such social challenges? Well, the pressure on the streets, right? The protests on the streets is the social pressure that is going to force companies, firms, policymakers, and politicians to change. So I think that's one of the interesting things about the Black Lives Matter movement, not very different from the civil rights movement or any other social movement you see around the world, anti-apartheid movement. These movements are designed to put pressure on policymakers and politicians, and it's effective. It can drive them to make decisions that are that will ultimately, in some instances, you know, these companies might lobby the government for some sort of concession. Yes, I'll raise the pay, the minimum wage pay, but I need some sort of tax concession. Those are sort of the backhand deals that take place behind the scenes that consumers will never be privy to.
Yeah.
So I think that we have sufficiently sort of talked through the big issues. I want to now talk a little bit about, should firms sort of continue this conversation, pick up this conversation on should firms sacrifice profits in the social interest? Well, I was looking, basically trying to find some data on what millennials think about this issue, because the millennials are the ones who are on the streets protesting. You know, and not for nothing, young people have always been instrumental in mobilizing change, right? So, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King was a very young man. He was in his early 20s when he started engaging in the civil rights movement. John Lewis, who just started, was a very young man. So young people are the pulse of a nation, and they give you some insights. So for that reason, I reached out to a couple of different firms to sort of see, you know, what are young people thinking about this? And in terms of social welfare, 40% of millennials polled for one survey feel like the goal of business should be to improve society. That means the benefits of CSR include direct welfare gains to individuals and community firms serve. And whether you're looking at NGOs or business leaders or religious faith leaders or political leaders, overwhelmingly, millennials are saying there is a responsibility, right, to improve society. We can't continue on the path that we're on. And that's really important, and that's really key. There are also legal, political, and social considerations here. One argument that I've found against CSR, there are many arguments against CSR, is that it's not a democratic process, right? That these firms aren't democracies, and that they're sitting around at in a boardroom thinking primarily about their bottom line. However, I challenge that argument by saying that under broader interpretations of the idea of social responsibility, it really can be argued that businesses have a moral commitment to hold themselves to a higher ethical standards, especially when you're embedded in communities across this country. And to that extent, you know, there are a lot of millennials engaging in the Black Lives Matter movement, but to that extent, they are absolutely right. And I agree with it. Firms should have a responsibility, should be held at a higher ethical standard when they engage in activities. It should benefit society. A colleague of mine who sits around the corner from my office, I reached out to him, Bernard Séligné. He is a French economist. His argument is that I asked him, I said, listen, should they sacrifice it? He said, no. I quote, I would say a resounding no. And that's because coming out of the French space, unions, progressive tax laws, and low wage subsidies is the underpinning of that space. Many things, he argues, would be more impactful than putting pressure on CSR. For example, less union unfriendly laws, a higher minimum wage, more progressive tax laws, low wage subsidies, and perhaps even taxing automation. That's the focus. In France, by law, unions play a very big and outsized role in companies. And that's really important and that's really key. So this is one perspective against the idea of putting pressure on firms to invest through CSR. Another argument is from a colleague of mine I mentioned a little bit earlier, Marianne Bertrand. She's also a French economist, but she's at Chicago and University of Chicago, and she talks an awful lot about corporate philanthropy as a tool for political influence. And she tells me that their estimates, based on a recent study that she did, it was published very, very recently, is that our estimates imply that 6.3% of corporate charitable giving may be politically motivated. And here's the rub: absent of disclosure requirements, charitable giving may be a form of corporate political influence that at this point is undetected by voters and subsidized taxpayers. Now, this is key because what she's suggesting here is that these companies are paying off politicians and they're getting tax subsidies underneath the table, and the voters aren't aware of it. So she absolutely disagrees with the idea of CSR. She thinks that it's a fraud, that it's a trick, and nobody should get caught up in this idea of corporate philanthropy, because corporations, as Friedman told us, is by design focused on profit. So what then is the best solution for inequality? I've given you a couple of different perspectives. I've shared what my hypothesis is, that we have tried a lot of different things over time. To my knowledge and to my experience, the legacy that Carson has left for us gives us a framework for which we can begin to think about a solution for inequality. Shared value, and I know you've read an awful lot about this work. Shared value creation focuses on identifying, expanding connections between societal and economic progress. Shared value comes out of the work of FSG and my colleague Mark Kramer, the work that he's doing at Harvard. But shared value is really a template for different types of strategies. It's a different template, but the same strategy has been implemented over time. It's often about cluster development. It's often about reconceiving products and markets, and it's often about redefining productivity in your value chain. We saw that with the CO2 tax. We saw that with the Clinton Climate Initiative. We see that with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We see that with Bloomberg's C40 cities, which was supposed to focus on changing at the city level. And we certainly see that with the cap and trade. It's always about, it really is about shared value, creating some sort of balance between societal and economic progress. Shared Value Initiative offers companies new ways to innovate, and it has for the past 25 years or so. It's new ways to innovate, new ways to compete, and new ways to create a business environment that is sustainable. And we see that evidence with IHG, which is Intercontinental Hotel Group, that offered 200 plus green solutions. Nestle, a chocolate company based in Pennsylvania, mobilizing 291,000 employees globally to come up with creative ideas to address nutrition, water access, and rural development. And then GE, which made this $6 billion contribution in 2005, which has since dried up, but their focus was on increasing access to health. Now, solid research has shown that changes that do cost money actually create shared value and certainly lead to both greater long-term corporate profitability and more prosperous and equitable and sustainable societies. But what does that really look like? For me, the focus is on a couple of things, and Mark Kramer has about a list of 10 things that companies can do to demonstrate shared value and demonstrate commitment to sustainably equitable society. Pay equity. Pay your workers, whether they are South Asians, African Americans, or Caucasian, the same wage, right? You don't gyp people based on their ethnic group. Historically in this country, Caucasians make the most, right? And then you have the pecking order, African Americans making a little bit less, and Latinos making still a little bit less, and Asians making a little bit less than that. What we're proposing here, and what Mark Kramer is suggesting as well, is that we pay our workers the same. Equal pay for equal work, regardless of ethnicity and regardless of gender. Also, companies can start to lobby for good, right? Companies like Walmart or Starbucks can certainly start lobbying for social good, lobbying for better legislation to address racial inequity in the United States, better legislation for, and Starbucks has been really good about this, is one of the companies, whether you're working part-time or full-time, you have access to healthcare through Starbucks. Not a lot of companies go there, so that's really a plus. Paying your workers a living wage. In the United States, due to the coronavirus lockdown, many people were furloughed and lost their jobs. Congress a few months ago decided to pay people, you could receive access to your unemployment insurance, which depending on what your salary was, could be anywhere, it could be a maximum of $500 a week, whatever your salary was. But also Congress decided to top that up with an additional $600 a week. Many people were able to continue living, paying their bills, and finding food for their family with that additional funding. Well, what do you know? Washington politicians decided to take that $600 away. And in doing so, it was so egregious because the fact that so many people were depending on $600, and they saw that as people need to go work. Well, the reality is that people can work in the United States, and especially a place like New York or California, $600 a week is certainly insufficient in terms of cost of living. So it really is a disgrace that if you're furloughed and staying home, you make more than what corporations and firms are paying you, right? That's a travesty. Firms need to all commit to paying people a living wage. As far as I'm concerned, if you're in New York or Washington, D.C., you need at least $1,000 a week for salary. But there are many people getting $300 a week, $400 a week, or $600 a week. And if you're living in this city, it's really, really impossible to find adequate housing and buy groceries and pay your telephone bill and transportation on $600 a week. We need to force corporations to pay a living wage. And that is something that corporations have the power to do based on the fact that you can pay a CEO $100 million, right? So we know that it is possible. But the question is whether or not they're willing to make that sacrifice. So all that is the best solution for inequality, corporate social responsibility. I still say, yes, let's march forward with this project. We can think about where we started in this conversation. There were many doubters, many people who doubted the contribution of Carson. But today, many of the chemicals Carson detailed in her book, Silent Spring, are now, in fact, targeted for global phase out by Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants more than 50 years later. I'll close with this final quote. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy. It's a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. Other fork of the road, the one less traveled, offers our last chance, our only chance to reach a destination that ensures the preservation of our earth. I take side with Carson and believe that we need to put pressure on the firms to take responsibility. Right? That's where I'm going to leave this conversation. Hopefully we could talk a little bit more about it. More responsibilities on firms, but I've given you a lot of different perspectives, and I'm hoping you can help us sort of go back and forth a little bit about how you think, where you think we can go.
Thank you for that lovely talk. I think students might, and my colleagues might have some questions. If you have some question, then you can either put it in the chat box or you can ask. It was really fascinating, Sophia. Like you know, the way you kind of put it from the social movement angle and Carson's book to you know, current situation, how it is going around, and whether CSR is the answer or what else is the answer. You know, that is something that we all need to think and internalize and perhaps do something about it rather than only you know, debate about it intellectually, but you know, what can really be done. And Kramer and Porter and Kramer's work is so important in this context.
Hi, I'm Akshita.
Hi.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Hi. So we were talking about how, you know, is it important for businesses to sacrifice their profits in order to, of course, you know, to work towards CSR. And I was really thinking, is it really sacrificing? I mean, when when anyone uses the word sacrificing, at least to me, it's like you have $10 and you're sacrificing 9 of them. It's like a big deal. But here, when you showed like the stats of these men of big firms earning so much profits, and let's take Jeff Bezos, for example. I mean, he's almost a trillionaire right now.
I know.
And people at Amazon are still living on, you know, the minimum wages. So what I was thinking, you know, is it really sacrificing of profits? And of course, stats have again and again shown that, you know, CSR has led to increasing profits because people, you know, connect with firm, as you mentioned, they believe in the values that these firms have, and that has again and again led to increasing sales. So is it really sacrificing, and why are not businesses thinking of it as a profitable venture rather than a social responsibility?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that, you know, I share the same sentiment. I think in many ways, this is very much about, it's not so much about sacrificing, right? But it really is profit sharing, right? But they have decided the best and appropriate, they have already put it out there. And now I guess I'm buying into the use of that vernacular, the idea that it is a sacrifice. So they have been very instrumental in marketing that language, that when you're biting into our profits, it's a sacrifice, right? So you're absolutely right. It should be viewed a little bit differently, but the firms have been really good about branding it in the minds and psyche of the community as a sacrifice, right? That should be managed and thought about in that context.
I'm sorry, Sophia, my electricity went away. So
yes, I heard. It reminds me of my days in Kashmir.
Yeah, so you know, it takes a while for it to come back. I was trying on my mobile as well; it was not working.
That's fine.
So I missed that, but I'm going to hear the recording and then I will know what you hear about. Yeah.
Yeah. So we
so
just
any other questions? Yeah.
We just talked very briefly about the use of the term sacrifice, right? sacrificing their profit, and whether or not it really is a sacrifice, or is it an investment in, is it a profit sharing, or is a sacrifice, right? So I think it certainly is not a sacrifice, but a lot of companies have been really instrumental in branding it as a sacrifice. And now I myself am now using the term, when indeed it's not a sacrifice. It really should be viewed as profit sharing. But yeah.
Yeah. You know, I was, anybody else has any question? Otherwise, I will ask one. Any other question?
Hi, Dr. Johnson. I did have a question. Yeah, so this sort of extends from what Akshita just asked. So my question is regarding, should CSR essentially be seen as a separate expenditure or an allocation? Because like in companies in India, what they do is a certain percentage of their profits is allocated into CSR activities. So my question is, rather than practicing CSR like this, wouldn't be a better way if they could integrate it within this business strategy and see CSR as a way of operating or a style of their work itself? Because in that way, integrating CSR practices and being socially and environmentally responsible in that way will also give a sustainable practice of what they're doing and essentially make them, walk the talk. So though firms, like it was also mentioned in your presentation, that firms are designed to be profit oriented, don't you think this is a better way of doing this? Because they are essentially a part of the society, and they are here to serve the interest of the consumers and a larger group in the sense. So would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Right. So first thought, Milton Friedman is king for corporations. He said what they wanted to hear, and they incorporate that exact language in their founding documents, right? And so we are at an interesting crossroads, asking corporations to think a little bit differently about what your purpose is, because what Friedman would have constructed, God rest his soul, is no longer valid in our time. And it's the same thing that we're dealing with the United States in terms of the Constitution today. We're now saying that the Constitution needs to be amended. And we know that amendments can be made to give women the right to vote, to give people the right to bear arms. There are amendments all over the place. And amendments can certainly be made for these corporations. But we're seeing certainly a resistance to changing this. But I absolutely believe that I agree with you. I think that it is time to think about this a little bit differently, and it is time for us to show up in the communities that we serve with some more responsibility. It's certainly on the shoulders of these corporations to think about what the next 500 years are going to look like into the future, whether it's the environment or health or other social inequalities.
Anything else? Anybody else has a question? So I'll go ahead and ask one. So, when I was doing my postdoc and I was in the US, there was this television series which started, American Muslims.
Yes.
And there was a lot of protest around it, and of course anti-minority protest. And I remember people who were basically sponsors of this program, like advertisement sponsors and all that, they decided to wash their hands off the program. Remember, that is what happened. And there was a lot of conversation, and of course there are all kinds of groups which are saying all different kinds of stuff. So but Black Lives Matters movement, interestingly, got a lot of support from people other than the minorities as well. While at that time it did not happen. So I'm just curious to understand that when businesses had to wash their hands off from such a program, and I remember because I was at that time doing my field work on Christian-Muslim relationship, and I had some connection with white right groups, and some of them actually would make comments like, American Muslim is a misnomer. There is no such thing, because you cannot be American with American values and be a Muslim. Okay, things like that. And corporations actually wash their hands off, and the series had to stop, if I remember correctly, or at least one or two definitely backed out. They said we will not sponsor it. So what has changed? Has anything changed, or is it like, what is it now that we have seen so much of, in spite of, in the middle of a pandemic, people coming out on the streets and protesting across all communities, and businesses were forced to, willingly or unwillingly, they were forced to respond to it, be it giving free frappuccino or whatever else it might be. They were forced to say something about it, right? So what really changed?
I think there's been a paradigmatic shift in the way we communicate with each other, but also in the communication that we receive. It's in real time, right? And so that's one piece of it, that information is here and is everywhere very quickly. And so that's communication piece is really critical. Another piece of the issue is we were at home in isolation, very vulnerable, and we were being very still. We had a moment, I think we had over time become numb to the violence that we see on social media, right? We see a police beating and then we see another one, but this was grotesque because someone had died before our eyes, and many of us had never seen someone die at the hands of another human being. That was really real, and it was in video, and it was in real time, and everyone saw it. Everyone is at home, and everyone was on pause. So it became a grotesque violation that even the firms themselves. Now, the good news is, I think one of the slides I shared with you is that these firms have the responsibility. They basically have responsibilities to create their boards. The good news for us is that a lot of these high-level firms had boardrooms with represented groups, minority groups. There were African Americans on boards at Franklin Templeton when that Caucasian woman was saying, there's a black man in the park trying to attack me with this, right? And there were African Americans on the board. I think there's one at Amazon. And so you have African Americans, Latinos at the table at these boards, Coca-Cola, Unilever, all these spaces, Latinos, Asians, African Americans at the table saying enough is enough. As a representative member of this group, I'm telling you that this has gone too far. And they were able to have the ear of the CEOs. And that's why diversity matters, right? And I think there was a lot of pressure during the time that you were here. American corporations were still working on diversifying their boards. And over time, it's not where we want it to be. It's not ideal. We still need to make sure they're more Indian Americans, there's been a strong push to get an Indian American on the Supreme Court, for example, or to get an Indian American, Secretary of State, or just to appoint a Chinese American to high-level governance, or Chinese Americans to lead certain firms. Everybody made a big deal when we had an Indian American heading up Microsoft. These are important signals to the community to let them know we have a shared value. We believe in diversity. So we're achieving it. We're moving in the right direction. But I think that now, as distinct to when you were here, this is what's going on, right? There is more representation, and we have access to ears that are willing to listen and recognize a challenge. When there are no visible minorities, when there are no Indian Americans, and there are no Latinos and African Americans at the table, nobody has to pay attention to an issue. Why should they? Right? So there's been a paradigmatic shift in the makeup of these corporations, the boards of these corporations across the country. I think that's instrumental. And that's why we're still pushing to address inequalities, right? Because we see that it works.
So this board, so is the board representation change that you mentioned, is that coming out of some legal change, or is it like a voluntary thing that is happening?
Well, I mean, it kind of is you know, you can't legislate anti-racism, right? You can't, this is very, you know, you can change policies and laws. I think that there's just more pressure on these corporations to do the right thing. And African Americans and civil rights activists in this country have been persistent, and Latinos and Asian Americans have been persistent in saying we want more representation. We want representation on the Supreme Court. We want some representation in our corporations. And they're pressuring these companies, and it's been persistent. And no, they weren't protesting in the streets, but the pressure has been persistent, because as you hire more and more Indian Americans in Silicon Valley, it stands to reason that you're gonna have to have some CEOs, right? You're gonna have to have some African-American CEOs or SVPs or something. You're gonna have to have more Latinos. As you employ them within the corporation, they become the lobby and the voice for the representation across the country. So that's why diversity, in my mind, really matters. It's important to have those different voices at the table.
So I think this will be the last question. There is one question Rishika is asking.
Okay.
Is mandating equal pay for some job positions a good idea? And CSR made voluntary in certain countries due to their negative connotation. What similar effective policies, I don't know if it is effective or not, but we constructed to ensure corporations still legally obliged to contribute socially.
So the first question, is mandating equal pay for same job position a good idea? Absolutely. Many people might not be aware, but if you interview a lot of HR managers, different people have different negotiating skills when they come to finding a job. It depends on their visa status. It depends on sometimes their gender. Some people get hired, you know, some people might, you know, the system's skewed. It's unfortunate. Some people might get hired for a job because they're perceived as cheaper labor, right? And that's problematic. And so we don't want a situation where you're going to pay someone $150,000 and then an African-American, Latino, or an Indian American come and you pay them $50,000 for the same job. We don't want a situation like that. We think that pay equity is critically important, especially if you're coming in at the same level. You both have MBAs, you both have the same qualifications. You should be offered the same job regardless of ethnic group and regardless of gender, right? And this is not a situation where you have a customer service person competing with an MBA. I'm talking about same qualification. There should be equity, whether you're a man or woman. In the United States, white men, for every $71 that a white male makes, a woman makes 70 cents. And if you're a person of and that a white woman makes 70 cents. If you're a person of a visible minority group, you're Latino or you're Indian American or you're African American, you're making less than a white woman, right? So that could be 60 cents or it could be 55 cents. That's not fair, right? You want everyone to be getting paid the same income based on your qualifications. And we don't want anybody sort of having the perception that this group of people, this ethnic group, they're cheap laborers anyway. So let's just hire a couple of them because they're cheap, right? You know, that's not the right attitude. So that's the one thing about equal pay. I think it's critically important. Is if CSR are to be made voluntary in certain countries due to their negative connotation, what similar effective policies can be constructed to ensure corporations are still legally obliged to contribute socially? You know, in that particular instance, I mean, it's going to take growth and it's going to take time. What we see in industrialized countries is not going to play out in the same way in developing country economies. I mean, there are budgetary constraints, there are different social pressures, there are different issues that need to be addressed. And in many developing country economies, you have a lot of NGOs sort of filling that gap. So I wonder, my thought is, you know, can we still legally oblige them to contribute socially? I think it's socially, it's getting them in a space where they can think about their social responsibility. But in terms of obliging them to do it, reinforcement becomes very difficult. I know in India, they do have legislation to address this, but it's not the same in a lot of different spaces. And I wonder about enforcement of that legislation in India. I don't know if Professor Goswami can speak to that. I had a conversation with Professor Bagwadi earlier today, but sorry about that. Yeah.
So I think, we have 2 minutes time, so we actually need to wrap it up. But CSR, there are some studies which show that in the Indian context, showing that all kinds of games are being played. So if your intent is not there and the regulation kind of forces you, what you're really doing is debatable. And whether it really does social good or not, that's again debatable.
Right.
But I'm not a CSR specialist, although I can get people to talk on CSR, but definitely in the Indian context, although it has been made compulsory, I'm sure some good has happened. 100%, some good definitely has happened. Something is better than nothing, but whether it's coming from intent to really do it or being forced to do it, or what good is really happening, that's, that time will say, and more detailed work needs to be taken up in order to understand that. But I really want to thank you, Sophia, for this lovely, lovely session. And I know that you and I had this conversation. So when I was making the course, I sent it to you and you said, what about social movements? And we had this conversation. And many things I included in the course because of the conversation I had. And I am so grateful that you made it, in spite of the fact that now it's actually you started when it was 1st September and you ended when it's 2nd September. So I think now it's what, 12 o'clock, 10:30, 11:30, 12:30, 1 a.m. at your place. So I am really, really grateful for this. And really, it comes from my heart.
Thank you.
And we will continue the conversation. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Bye-bye. Take care.